You were never her real father." The words didn't echo. They landed, sharp, quiet, impossible to ignore, as if the entire room had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe. Jonathan Pierce stood motionless in the center of his private legal office in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where glass walls caught the gray skyline and turned it into something colder, more distant. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm of taxis, horns, and rushing footsteps. But inside, time had folded in on itself. Ava Brooks, a small black girl no taller than the edge of the polished mahogany table, held a sealed folder against her chest like it weighed more than it should have, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match her age. Jonathan's gaze flickered from her face to the document in her hands, then to the woman standing near the window, Victoria Hale, his longtime legal advisor, whose expression had tightened just slightly at the corners, like someone trying to hold a door closed against pressure from the other side. "Say that again," Jonathan said finally, his voice controlled but lower than before, as if volume itself might break something fragile in the air. Ava didn't flinch. She stepped forward and placed the folder on the table with both hands, carefully, deliberately, as though this moment had already happened somewhere else, and she was just completing it here. "She's not your daughter," Ava repeated softly, and then added, "Not the way you think." A long silence followed, thick enough that even the faint hum of the building's ventilation seemed intrusive. Jonathan's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, not quite gripping, not quite releasing, caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Victoria moved first, her heels clicking once against the floor as she approached. "Ava," she said carefully, "you don't understand what you're implying. That file is sensitive, and you shouldn't have accessed it." But Ava's eyes didn't leave Jonathan. "I didn't access it," she said. "I was given it. By someone who said he couldn't carry it anymore." The words shifted something in the room, subtle but undeniable. Jonathan finally looked down at the folder. His name was printed on the front, followed by a case number he didn't immediately recognize. Adoption records, restricted. The phrase should have felt familiar. It didn't. Or maybe it did, in a way that his mind had never allowed itself to fully touch. Slowly, he reached for it, his movements controlled, precise, like a man approaching something that might detonate if handled wrong. When his fingers touched the edge, Ava spoke again, quieter this time, almost like she was reading something she had rehearsed in her head 100 times, but still didn't fully believe. "Open it." Jonathan hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, then opened the folder. Papers unfolded under his hands, crisp, official, stamped and signed. Names, dates, institutional seals. But it wasn't the structure that changed his expression, it was the details that didn't align. A signature that looked close, but not exact. A date that overlapped with a memory he couldn't quite place. A line that had been amended, not erased, as if someone had tried to rewrite history without fully destroying it. His breath slowed, not because he was calm, but because something in him had stopped recognizing the ground beneath his feet. Victoria stepped closer, her voice now more urgent. "Jonathan, these documents are part of an old file transfer. There were complications years ago. You knew there were complications." "I knew nothing like this," Jonathan said quietly, eyes still locked on the page. Ava tilted her head slightly. "You signed something," she said, "but you never saw what was underneath it. That was when the first crack appeared, not in the paper, not in the room, but in him. A subtle shift in his posture, the smallest withdrawal of certainty, like a structure discovering it had been built on uneven ground. His mind began to reach backward without permission, pulling fragments of time he had never fully examined. A hospital corridor, a hurried conversation, a pen placed in his hand, someone saying it's standard, someone else saying she'll be safe. But the faces were blurred, the voices incomplete, as if memory itself had been edited. "Who gave you this?" Jonathan asked, finally looking at Ava. Again, she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the folder, then back up at him, her voice steady but quieter now. "Someone who said you deserved to know before it was too late." The room seemed to tighten around that sentence. Victoria turned her head slightly, as if calculating something invisible. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that doesn't bring relief but instead makes space for realization. "Before what was too late?" he asked. Ava didn't answer that either. Instead, she placed one more item on the table, A smaller document, folded carefully, worn at the edges, as if it had been carried too many times from place to place. Jonathan didn't touch it right away. He just stared at it, as if waiting for it to explain itself. Outside, a siren passed somewhere far below, faint and detached from this moment. But inside the room, everything had already changed shape. Jonathan finally reached for the second document, his hand slower now, less certain. Ava watched him closely, not with triumph, not with fear, but with something closer to quiet resolve, as if she had already lived through the moment he was only beginning to enter. And when he opened it, the name at the top was not his own, but a variation of it he had never seen before, connected to a child's file that should not have existed beside his life at all. The air in the room didn't move after that. It simply waited, as if the truth had finally arrived and was deciding what it would become next. The silence in the room did not break. It simply shifted, like a weight settling deeper into the walls. Jonathan Pierce stood still, his eyes locked on the document in his hands, but his mind was no longer fully inside the office. It was moving backward through fragments he had never questioned before, fragments that now felt suspiciously incomplete. Ava Brooks remained where she was, small and steady, her hands now resting loosely at her sides as if she had already said everything she needed to say and was simply waiting for the truth to finish unfolding on its own. Victoria Hale stepped closer to the table, her voice carefully measured, but no longer as controlled as before. She said, "Jonathan, these papers are not what they seem at first glance. There are administrative layers, legal adjustments, procedural transfers. You are looking at fragments, not the full context." Jonathan did not respond immediately. His eyes traced a line of text again, slower this time, as if repetition might change its meaning. Fragments, he repeated quietly, not as a question, but as something testing itself against reality. Ava tilted her head slightly. "That is what she told you too, right?" she asked. Victoria's gaze sharpened instantly. "Ava, stop." But Jonathan raised a hand, not looking away from the girl. "Let her speak," he said. His voice was lower now, less certain, as if authority itself had started to feel optional in this room. Ava took a small breath, then continued. "She said a lot of things were incomplete. She said people like you do not get the full story unless someone forces it into your hands." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly at that, not in anger, but in something closer to discomfort. He finally set the folder down on the table, carefully, as if it might still shift under its own weight. "Who is she?" he asked, "the one who gave you this?" Ava hesitated for the first time. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Then she said, "Someone who used to work for your family office. Before everything changed." Victoria exhaled sharply, stepping forward. "That is not relevant to this conversation." Ava turned her gaze toward her. "It is relevant if she was the one who signed off on moving me." The word hung in the air differently than the others. Not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely, like a pin placed into a map. Jonathan's eyes lifted slightly. "Moved," he repeated. Ava nodded once. "From one record to another. From one name to another." Jonathan looked down again at the papers. His fingers moved across the edge of the page, stopping at a section that listed a guardian approval. The signature was there, but the accompanying note beside it was not something he remembered approving. In fact, it described a condition he had never been told about. His breathing slowed again, not because he was calm, but because something inside him was resisting the pace of realization. "This is not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Ava stepped closer to the table now, just enough that her reflection appeared faintly in the polished surface. "You keep saying that," she said, "but I have been reading this for 3 months. Every version says the same thing in different words." Victoria's voice sharpened. "You should not have had access to any of this." Ava looked at her. "Then why did someone make sure I would find it anyway?" That question changed the temperature of the room again. Jonathan finally looked directly at Ava without the documents between them. For the first time, he seemed to be seeing her not as a child delivering information, but as part of something larger that he had been unknowingly standing inside of for years. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and the question was not defensive. It was uncertain. Ava's answer came without hesitation. "I do not want anything from you. I want you to stop assuming you already know what happened." Silence followed again, but this time it was different. Less frozen, more unstable, like the room itself had lost its ability to settle. Jonathan moved around the table slowly, stopping near the window. Outside, Chicago's skyline remained unchanged, indifferent to whatever truths were being unearthed inside this glass-walled office. He looked at his reflection for a moment, then spoke without turning around. If what you are saying is true, then there is a gap in my memory that is not small. Ava nodded slightly. It is not a gap, she said. It is a replacement. That word made Victoria turn her head sharply, but she did not interrupt. Jonathan finally turned back. Replacement, he repeated. Ava continued. You were told a version of events that made everything simple. That is what rich people are always given. Simple answers. Jonathan's expression tightened at that, but he did not argue. Instead, he walked back to the table and placed both documents side by side. For a long moment, he studied them without speaking. Then he said quietly, if I accept that something was altered, then I have to accept that I was not the one who made the decision I remember making. Ava did not answer immediately. She only watched him. Victoria stepped in again, more urgently now. Jonathan, this is speculative at best. You are reacting to incomplete paperwork and emotional manipulation. Ava's voice cut through that immediately, still calm. Then explain why the dates do not match your own records. Victoria stopped, just for a fraction of a second. That pause was enough. Jonathan saw it. Ava saw it. And in that shared recognition, something shifted that could not be undone by explanation alone. Jonathan slowly sat down at the edge of the table, his eyes no longer focused on the documents, but on the space between them. Start from the beginning, he said quietly, not as a command, but as a request that carried more weight than any order he had ever given. Ava nodded once. Then listen carefully, she said, because the beginning is not where you think it is. Jonathan Pierce did not speak for several seconds after Ava Brooks finished her last sentence. The office felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the idea of beginning had been pulled out from under everything he thought he understood. He sat at the edge of the long glass table, his hands resting loosely in front of him, no longer the posture of a man conducting business, but of someone trying to assemble a memory that refused to stay in place. Ava stood across from him, still calm, but her eyes carried a quiet intensity that suggested she had already lived through this conversation many times before arriving here. Victoria Hale remained near the window, her arms now crossed, her expression no longer purely defensive but carefully guarded, as if she was measuring how much of the past could safely be allowed into the present. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low. You said the beginning is not what I think it is. Then tell me what it is. Ava looked down at the table for a moment, then gently slid another sheet of paper forward. It was not part of the official file. It looked older, less formal, as if it had been handled outside of institutional control. This is the first record, she said. Jonathan picked it up slowly. It was a hospital intake summary dated years earlier, from a private medical facility in upstate New York. His eyes scanned the document, and for the first time, his breathing changed slightly. Not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. This is not in my system, he said. Victoria responded quickly. Because it was never meant to be. Jonathan looked up at her sharply. Explain. Victoria hesitated. That hesitation lasted just long enough to confirm that whatever came next would not be simple. There were circumstances at the time, she said carefully. Complications involving documentation, guardianship transitions, and timing conflicts between legal filings. Ava interrupted softly. You mean I was recorded twice? Victoria did not correct her. Jonathan set the paper down again, more slowly this time. 2 records, he repeated. Ava nodded. One that says I belonged where I was supposed to stay. One that says I was moved. Jonathan leaned back slightly, staring at the ceiling for a moment, as if trying to locate logic somewhere above the conversation. Why would that happen? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine attempt to find structure in something collapsing. Ava answered before Victoria could. Because someone did not want the first record to be the only one you ever saw. The room grew still again, but this time it was not empty silence. It was tension layered over understanding. Jonathan looked at Ava more closely now, noticing details he had previously overlooked. The way she held her posture. The way she did not rush to fill silence. The way she seemed more aware of the documents than any adult in the room. How long have you had access to this? He asked. Ava considered the question. long enough to know that most people do not ask the right one. Victoria stepped forward slightly. Jonathan, this is being framed incorrectly. These are administrative inconsistencies, not intentional deception. Ava turned her head toward Victoria. Then why does every inconsistency point to the same signature? That question landed heavier than the previous ones. Jonathan reached for the document again, focusing on the signature line. It was his name, or at least something that resembled it closely enough that most people would not question it. But now, looking at it under this context, it felt unfamiliar, like handwriting that had been imitated rather than authored. This, Jonathan said quietly, does not feel like mine. Victoria responded immediately. It is yours. You have verified it before. Jonathan looked at her. When? A pause. Victoria's certainty weakened slightly. Years ago, during final review. Ava spoke again, her voice steady. Final review of which version? No one answered immediately. Outside, the light shifted across the city skyline, moving slowly across the glass walls of the office, marking time that no one inside was fully tracking anymore. Jonathan stood up and walked toward the window, placing one hand lightly against the glass. From this height, the city looked organized, structured, predictable. But inside this room, structure was beginning to feel like an illusion. If there are two records, he said finally, then one of them was created to replace the other. Ava nodded once. Yes. Jonathan turned back toward her. And you were saying I never saw the first one. You saw what they wanted you to see, Ava replied. Victoria shook her head slightly. This is speculation built on incomplete archival access. Ava's tone did not change. Then let us complete it. Jonathan looked between them, sensing the divide not just in information, but in intention. Where is the original record? He asked. Ava stepped closer to the table again and placed her hand gently on the first document she had brought. Not here, she said. Not in any system you control. Jonathan narrowed his eyes slightly. Then how do you know it exists? Ava looked at him directly. Because I was there when it was separated. The words created a stillness so complete that even Victoria stopped moving. Jonathan's voice lowered. You were there. Ava nodded. Not as a subject of the record. As someone who saw it happen. The implication settled into the room slowly, like something too large to process all at once. Jonathan returned to his seat, not out of surrender, but because. Standing suddenly felt unnecessary. Then start there, he said quietly. Ava did not hesitate this time. The beginning is not the document, she said. It is the decision to split it. Jonathan Pierce did not respond immediately after Ava Brooks finished speaking. The phrase decision to split lingered in the air of the glass-walled office like something too precise to ignore and too heavy to fully understand at once. He remained seated, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his hands no longer gripping anything but instead resting open, as if even control itself had become uncertain. Victoria Hale stood near the window, her posture now tighter than before, her eyes shifting between Jonathan and Ava with increasing hesitation, as though she could sense the conversation moving toward a place she no longer fully controlled. Ava stood still across from them, not impatient, not anxious, simply present, as if time itself had stopped being a pressure she needed to respond to. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. You keep using that word. Decision. Ava nodded once. Because it was not an accident. It was a decision made in a room where you were not the only one signing things. Victoria stepped forward immediately. That is not accurate. There were standard legal procedures, and all records were processed under proper authorization. Ava turned her head toward her slowly. Then why are there two authorization chains? The question was simple, but it changed the atmosphere instantly. Jonathan looked at Victoria now, not as an advisor, but as someone evaluating the consistency of her presence in his own history. Two chains, he repeated. Ava reached into the folder again and removed a second set of documents, placing them carefully on the table beside the others. This one is the duplicate system record, she said. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, scanning the header. It matched the first in structure, but not in detail. There were differences in timestamps, differences in reviewer initials, and subtle changes in sequencing that suggested deliberate separation rather than clerical error. These are not supposed to exist side by side, Victoria said quickly, her voice sharper now. Ava replied calmly. But they do. Jonathan looked between the two sets of documents. Why would anyone create a second version? He asked slowly. If the first one was valid. Ava paused briefly, then answered, because the first version did not produce the outcome someone wanted. The room seemed to tighten again at that sentence. Jonathan stood up slowly and walked toward the table, placing both hands on its surface, leaning in as if proximity could clarify contradiction. Outcome, he repeated. You are saying this was intentional manipulation of identity records. Victoria interrupted immediately. Jonathan, that is a serious accusation based on incomplete interpretation. Ava did not raise her voice, then explained the missing 96 hours. That phrase caused Jonathan to stop moving entirely. Victoria's expression shifted subtly, a fraction of hesitation that was almost imperceptible but still visible to someone watching closely. Jonathan turned slightly toward Ava. 96 hours, he repeated. Ava nodded. Between the first record and the second one being finalized. Jonathan exhaled slowly, as if the number itself had weight. What happened in those 96 hours? Ava looked down at the documents for a moment, then back at him. That is where the decision was made. Victoria's voice tightened. You are not supposed to have access to that level of historical audit metadata. Ava responded quietly, but someone made sure I did. Jonathan turned fully toward Victoria now. Did I approve anything during that time window? Victoria hesitated again, longer this time. You were present for consultation discussions. Jonathan's gaze sharpened slightly. That is not the same as approval. Victoria did not answer immediately. That silence was different from earlier silences. It was not tension between unknowns. It was tension between what could be said and what could no longer be contained. Ava stepped forward slightly, closing the distance to the table. There is something else, she said. Jonathan looked at her. What else? Ava placed a final sheet of paper on top of the others. It was not a formal document. It looked like a scanned internal memo, marked with revision notes and timestamps that suggested last-minute changes. Jonathan picked it up slowly. As he read it, his expression shifted for the first time in a visible way. Not shock, not anger, but recognition struggling to align with disbelief. Victoria stepped closer. Jonathan, that document is not part of your official record set. It was flagged as non-binding internal draft material. Jonathan did not look away from the page. It references my signature protocol, he said quietly. Ava nodded. Because it was used to validate the second version. Jonathan lowered the paper slightly, his eyes no longer fixed on the text, but on the implication forming beneath it. So someone used a draft system to overwrite an official record, he said slowly. Ava corrected him gently. They did not overwrite it. They separated it. Jonathan turned toward her. Why? Ava looked at him directly. Because keeping it whole would have forced a different legal conclusion about custody continuity. The word custody landed differently than the others. It removed abstraction. It introduced consequence. Jonathan sat down again, more slowly this time, as if his body had started responding to the weight of information before his mind had fully processed it. Custody continuity, he repeated. Ava nodded. That is the part no one wanted you to question. Victoria finally spoke again, but her tone had changed. Less defensive now, more controlled. Jonathan, if what you are inferring is correct, then multiple departments would have had to coordinate across jurisdictions. That level of coordination is not realistic without oversight. Ava responded without hesitation. Then ask yourself why there is no oversight record for those 96 hours. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his eyes moving between Ava and Victoria. For the first time, the structure of authority in the room no longer felt stable. You are saying, he said slowly, that part of my life was recorded, then intentionally isolated, and then never shown to me again. Ava nodded once. Yes. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, not in denial, but in processing something that had no immediate emotional category. When he opened them again, he looked at Ava differently. And you, he said quietly, were inside that separation. Ava did not deny it. I saw it happen, she said. Victoria stepped forward again, but her voice was no longer sharp. It was controlled, almost careful. Jonathan, you need to understand that interpretation without full institutional context can lead to incorrect conclusions. Jonathan looked at her. Then give me the context. Victoria paused. Ava did not. She simply waited. And in that moment, Jonathan Pierce realized that whatever answer came next would no longer be about documents at all, but about what had been deliberately left out of them. The room remained still after Ava Brooks finished speaking, but it was no longer the same kind of stillness as before. Something had shifted from explanation into consequence, as if the words themselves had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Jonathan Pierce sat in silence, his eyes no longer focused on any single document, but instead on the space between them, where meaning had begun to accumulate too quickly for comfort. Victoria Hale stood near the window, no longer interrupting, no longer correcting, only observing with attention that suggested she was recalculating every possible outcome in real time. Ava remained standing across from Jonathan, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a quiet finality, as if the conversation had reached the point she had been guiding it toward all along. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before, careful, as though even sound might distort what remained of clarity. "If what you are saying is true," he said slowly, "then this was not just a procedural adjustment. It was a controlled separation of identity records tied to custody decisions that affected real-life outcomes." Ava nodded once. Yes. The simplicity of her answer made the complexity of everything else feel heavier. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, placing both hands flat on the table, as if grounding himself in something physical could stabilize what was no longer conceptual. "Then there has to be a central authorization point," he said. "A decision node. Someone who initiated the split." Victoria spoke cautiously now, her voice measured but less resistant than before. "If such a node existed, it would be embedded within legacy oversight protocols that are not accessible through standard corporate or legal review systems." Jonathan turned his head slightly toward her. "That sounds like avoidance dressed as procedure." Victoria did not respond immediately. Ava stepped closer to the table, her eyes moving between them. "It is not hidden in the system because it was never meant to be questioned inside the system," she said. Jonathan looked at her. "Then where is it meant to be questioned?" Ava paused briefly, then replied, "Outside of it." That answer created a shift that was less about information and more about direction. Jonathan slowly stood up again, this time not pacing or retreating to the window, but instead moving toward the edge of the office where a secondary terminal was built into the wall. It was a secure access point, rarely used for anything outside encrypted historical records. He placed his hand on the interface, but did not activate it immediately. "If there is something beyond standard records," he said, "then I want access to the full audit trail for every transaction connected to the first and second record sets." Victoria stepped forward quickly. "Jonathan, that level of access will trigger institutional review flags. It will escalate beyond this office." Jonathan did not turn. "That is already happening," he said quietly. Ava watched him closely, her expression unchanged, but her eyes following every movement with precise attention. Jonathan initiated the access sequence. The interface responded with a soft confirmation tone, followed by a delay that felt longer than it should have. No one spoke during the wait. Even the city outside seemed distant, reduced to abstract motion behind the glass. Finally, the screen shifted. Lines of data appeared, not fully human-readable at first, then resolving into structured logs. Jonathan scanned them quickly at first, then more slowly as patterns began to emerge. His expression changed gradually, not all at once. Victoria moved closer behind him, reading over his shoulder, her breathing slightly controlled but uneven. Ava remained still, waiting. Jonathan stopped at a specific entry. His eyes narrowed slightly. "This timestamp matches the 96-hour gap," he said. Ava nodded. "Yes." Jonathan continued reading. The logs did not describe actions in emotional terms. They were procedural, neutral, but the neutrality made them more unsettling, not less. System reclassification, record segmentation, identity indexing adjustment, custody alignment reassignment. Each phrase was technically precise, but collectively they formed something that felt less like administration and more like reconstruction. Jonathan leaned back slightly. "This was not a single decision," he said. "This was a sequence." Ava answered quietly. "Yes." It required continuity across multiple stages to avoid detection. Victoria finally spoke again, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Even if this is accurate, it still does not explain intent. Systems like this are often used for protection, not manipulation. Ava turned toward her. Protection of what? She asked. Victoria hesitated. Jonathan answered instead, still looking at the screen. Protection of outcome stability, he said slowly, as if the phrase itself was something he had heard before but never understood until now. Ava nodded once. Exactly. Jonathan looked away from the screen and toward the city beyond the glass. For a moment, he did not speak. When he did, his voice was quieter. If this was done for stability, then someone decided instability would come from truth being visible. Ava replied, or from you asking the wrong question at the wrong time. That statement lingered in the room longer than anything before it. Jonathan turned back to the terminal, then stepped away from it entirely. Then the question is not only what happened, he said, but why I was not allowed to see it happen. Victoria crossed her arms slowly, her expression now distant. Because seeing it would have changed your decisions afterward, she said. Jonathan looked at her. That assumes I was meant to make different decisions. Ava stepped closer again, her voice steady but softer than before. You were meant to continue believing the version that already existed. Jonathan studied her for a moment. And you, he said, were not part of that version. Ava shook her head. No. A silence followed that was no longer about missing information, but about the realization that information alone would not resolve what they were looking at. Jonathan finally closed the interface, and the screen went dark. Then we cannot resolve this from here, he said. Victoria frowned slightly. Where do you intend to go? Jonathan looked at Ava. Where it was first separated. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. Then you will need to see what was removed, not just what was kept. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if accepting that the next step would no longer be about interpretation, but about recovery of something deliberately placed out of reach. The three of them stood in silence again, but this time the silence felt like transition rather than stasis, as if the room itself had agreed that what came next could no longer remain inside it. The decision to leave the office did not come with discussion or hesitation. It came with movement. Jonathan Pierce gathered only what was necessary, his expression no longer carrying the certainty of a man returning to control, but the focus of someone following a path that had already been chosen without his awareness. Ava Brooks walked slightly ahead of him in the elevator descent, her small frame steady, her gaze fixed forward as if she had already mapped the next several steps long before they were spoken. Victoria Hale followed in silence, her phone pressed once against her ear before she ended the call, choosing instead to keep whatever distance remained inside the unfolding situation. The building lobby was colder than expected for a late afternoon in Chicago, the glass doors opening to a city that continued its normal rhythm without acknowledging that something irreversible had just shifted inside one of its highest towers. A black vehicle waited at the curb, assigned without announcement, as if the system itself had anticipated the movement. Jonathan paused for only a moment before entering. No one spoke during the drive. The streets passed in muted layers of motion, traffic lights reflecting across the windows like passing signals that no one inside the vehicle was ready to interpret. Ava sat in the rear seat opposite Jonathan, holding the same folder now closed but still present, her hands resting on it with quiet familiarity. Jonathan watched her once, then turned his attention toward the city outside, though his mind remained fixed on the sequence of events that had led them here. Victoria broke the silence first, her voice careful. The location you requested is not publicly accessible. It is maintained under legacy archival authority. Jonathan did not turn. I am aware, he said. Ava looked up slightly at that, but said nothing. The vehicle turned off the main avenue and into a quieter district where older institutional buildings stood with less architectural attention, as if their purpose mattered more than their appearance. The car slowed in front of a structure that did not display a name prominently, only a set of minimal identifiers near a secured entry point. Jonathan stepped out first. The air outside felt different, not physically, but conceptually, as if the environment itself had been designed to discourage curiosity. Ava followed without hesitation. Victoria paused briefly before joining them. At the entrance, a security verification process activated automatically, scanning identifiers without requiring verbal confirmation. After a brief delay, the doors unlocked with a soft mechanical sound. Inside, the lighting was neutral, the kind used in places where emotional context was intentionally reduced. They were met by a single archival administrator, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor that suggested familiarity with controlled information environments. He acknowledged Jonathan with a respectful nod, then turned his attention briefly to Ava, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly before returning to professional neutrality. "You requested access to historical custody separation records," he said. Jonathan replied, "Yes." The administrator did not question further. Instead, he led them through a corridor lined with sealed storage units, each marked with coded identifiers rather than names. Ava walked slightly closer to Jonathan as they moved, her attention focused on the environment, not with curiosity alone, but with recognition. Victoria observed her carefully but remained silent. They stopped at a secure terminal room. The administrator activated a console and turned slightly toward Jonathan. "This level of access is restricted to original authorization holders or individuals listed within the separation audit chain," he said. Jonathan stepped forward. "Then grant access under my authorization profile." The administrator hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. The system responded slowly, as if retrieving information that had not been accessed in a long time. Files began to populate the screen, not as simple documents, but as layered records containing cross-referenced histories, timestamps, and segmented annotations. Ava moved closer to the screen without touching it. Jonathan scanned the first set of entries. These were older than anything he had previously seen, predating the records he had accessed in his office. Victoria leaned in slightly, her expression tightening as she recognized structural inconsistencies between classification layers. Jonathan spoke quietly. "This is not just separation. This is restructuring across multiple institutional levels." The administrator responded, "These are continuity adjustment logs." Jonathan turned toward him. "Explain." The administrator hesitated briefly, then said, "Certain custody records were realigned to prevent conflicting identity claims during transitional legal periods." Ava looked at Jonathan. "That is the language they used," she said softly. Jonathan studied the screen further. One entry was highlighted automatically, as if the system itself had marked it for attention. He selected it. The file opened to a detailed sequence showing a chain of custody modification that spanned multiple institutions, each confirming a version of identity alignment that differed slightly but consistently enough to appear legitimate in isolation. Jonathan's breathing slowed as he read further. Victoria spoke quietly behind him. "This level of coordination would require authorization beyond corporate structure." Jonathan did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on a single line in the record that referenced a transitional custody reassignment executed during the 96-hour window they had previously discussed. Ava stepped closer, her voice steady. "This is where the decision became irreversible." Jonathan finally spoke, not looking away from the screen. "Then who approved continuity after the split?" The administrator answered cautiously. Continuity approval was distributed across multiple custodial authorities to ensure procedural neutrality. Ava turned slightly toward him. "That means no single person was accountable." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. "That means someone designed it so accountability could not be traced to one point." The room fell into silence again, but this time it was not absence of information, it was accumulation. Jonathan stepped back from the terminal slightly, his gaze shifting between the records and Ava. For the first time, his voice carried something closer to realization than analysis. "Then the question is not only what was changed," he said slowly, "but why I was kept close enough to believe nothing had changed at all." Ava met his eyes directly. "That is the part they never wanted you to reach." The silence inside the archival terminal room did not fade after the last statement. Instead, it deepened, as if the space itself had absorbed the weight of what Ava Brooks had just said. Jonathan Pierce stood still in front of the screen, his eyes fixed on the layered records that continued to scroll slowly, each line reinforcing a structure of decisions that no longer felt isolated, but interconnected in a way that suggested design rather than coincidence. Victoria Hale remained slightly behind him, her arms now lowered, her expression no longer defensive but contemplative, as if she was recalculating her entire understanding of the system she had once defended with certainty. Ava stood closest to the terminal, her gaze steady, not on the data itself, but on Jonathan, as if watching not his reaction, but the moment of recognition forming inside him. The archival administrator observed quietly from the side, his hands folded in front of him, maintaining professional distance while clearly aware that the conversation had moved beyond standard procedural explanation. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice measured but lower than before. If everything we have seen so far is connected, then there must be a central origin point. A first authorization. A single initiating structure that allowed all of this to exist. The administrator hesitated briefly before responding. There is a reference node in the system, but it is not classified as an individual authorization. It is categorized as a foundational continuity directive. Jonathan turned slightly toward him. Foundational continuity directive, he repeated. Ava nodded faintly, as if confirming something she already expected to be said. Victoria stepped forward a little. That type of directive is typically theoretical. It is used to maintain structural consistency across multi-layer custody systems. It is not meant to represent a person or a single decision. Jonathan looked back at the screen. But it still originates from somewhere, he said. Ava spoke quietly. Everything originates from somewhere. The administrator approached the terminal and entered a secure command. The screen shifted again, this time opening a deeper layer of archived structure, one that did not display individual records but instead displayed a framework map of decisions, branches, and sealed intersections. At the center of the map was a node labeled only with a time reference and a neutral designation code, without identifying attribution. Jonathan leaned closer. That node, he said slowly, is the split point. The administrator confirmed with a slight nod. Yes, that is the point where custody continuity was divided into parallel record streams. Victoria frowned slightly. Why is there no name attached to it? The administrator answered carefully. Because attribution was intentionally removed during system stabilization. Ava stepped closer to the screen. Not removed, she said softly. Separated. Jonathan looked at her. You keep returning to that word. Ava met his gaze. Because that is. What happened? A long pause followed. The kind of pause where every participant in the room understands that the next answer will not be informational alone, but structural to everything that has been built before it. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Then show me what existed before the split. The administrator hesitated again, longer this time. Victoria spoke quietly. Jonathan, that level of historical reconstruction may not be fully intact. Some pre-split records are deliberately non-recoverable due to integrity safeguards. Jonathan turned toward her. Or due to exposure risk. Victoria did not respond. The administrator finally activated a deeper retrieval layer. The screen dimmed slightly before displaying a single consolidated entry marked as pre-continuity alignment. It contained minimal metadata, but what it revealed was not just a record. It was a reference structure that predated all previous documents they had seen. Jonathan read silently for several seconds. Ava did not move. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned the structure. This does not reference custody in the way we have been analyzing it, she said quietly. It references guardianship assignment under observational oversight. Jonathan focused on one specific section. Observational oversight, he repeated. Ava nodded. That is the layer that existed before decisions were divided into separate outcomes. Jonathan looked at her. And after the split? Ava answered without hesitation. After the split, oversight became interpretation. The meaning of that statement lingered in the room longer than anything else so far. Jonathan stepped back slightly, as if physically creating distance from the implications forming in front of him. So what I have been calling records, he said slowly, are interpretations of a single original structure that I was never allowed to see in its entirety. The administrator responded cautiously. That is a simplified way to describe system evolution, yes. Ava turned slightly toward him. It is not evolution, she said. It is segmentation. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice quieter now. Even if segmentation occurred, it does not automatically imply manipulation of intent. Systems of this scale often evolve beyond original design constraints. Ava looked at her. Then why does every segment point back to the same missing 96 hours? The room fell into silence again. Jonathan returned his gaze to the central node on the screen. If that is the origin point, he said slowly, then everything we have seen is downstream from a single unknown decision. Ava nodded. Yes. Jonathan turned slightly toward her. And you said you were there when it was separated. Ava did not look away. I was. The administrator shifted slightly, as if uncertain whether he was still part of the conversation or merely witnessing it. Victoria's expression tightened again, but not with resistance this time, rather with concern about what could come next. Jonathan looked at Ava for a long moment before speaking. Then tell me exactly what you saw in that moment before everything became two versions of the same truth. Ava took a quiet breath. I saw the moment the record stopped being one story, she said, and became something that would never be seen the same way twice again. The words lingered in the archival chamber long after Ava Brooks finished speaking, as if the air itself had decided to store them rather than let them fade. Jonathan Pierce remained standing in front of the reconstructed system map, his eyes fixed on the central node that represented the origin of everything they had uncovered so far. The display did not move now. It simply held, like a paused breath waiting for permission to continue. Victoria Hale stood slightly behind him, her posture more restrained than before, as though the weight of what she had seen was beginning to override her instinct to interpret it professionally. The archival administrator remained at a respectful distance, his hands now resting lightly on the edge of the console, ready but no longer leading. Ava Brooks stood closest to the screen, her gaze steady, not on the node itself anymore, but on Jonathan, as if measuring the moment when understanding would stop being theoretical and become irreversible. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost detached from the intensity of the room. You said you saw the moment the record stopped being one story, he said slowly, and became something that could never be seen the same way twice again. Explain what that means. Ava did not answer immediately. Her eyes shifted briefly to the central node on the screen, then back to him. It means there was a point where truth stopped being stored as a single sequence, she said, and instead, it was divided into outcomes that were allowed to exist separately without ever being reconciled. Victoria frowned slightly. That is not a technical description. That is interpretation. Ava turned toward her. It is what it looked like from inside it. Jonathan stepped slightly closer to the console, his reflection faint in the glass of the display. Inside what? He asked. Ava hesitated for the first time in several exchanges, not because she was uncertain, but because what she was about to describe required precision that language did not easily hold. Inside the transition layer, she said finally. The administrator looked up slightly at that phrase, but did not interrupt. Jonathan repeated it slowly. Transition layer. Ava nodded. It is the space between what the system records and what the system decides to preserve as accessible history. Victoria's voice tightened slightly. That is not an officially defined layer in any known institutional framework. Ava responded calmly. That is because it was never meant to be defined publicly. Jonathan looked at the central node again. So everything we have been calling records, he said, exists after this transition layer filters what is allowed to remain visible. Ava nodded once. Yes. The room fell into a deeper stillness, one that felt less like silence and more like compression. Jonathan slowly turned toward the administrator. When this system was first built, was there ever a version where the record remained unified? The administrator hesitated before answering. Early prototypes did not include segmentation architecture, he said carefully. But those systems were deemed unstable due to conflicting custody interpretations across jurisdictions. Jonathan narrowed his eyes slightly. So, segmentation was introduced as a solution. The administrator nodded. To prevent contradictory legal outcomes from coexisting in active review systems. Ava stepped closer to the screen again. That is the official explanation, she said quietly. Jonathan turned toward her. And your explanation? Ava looked at the central node. My explanation is that segmentation did not remove contradiction. It only separated who was allowed to see it. Victoria crossed her arms again, but more slowly than before. That distinction does not change the operational intent of the system, she said. Ava turned to her. It changes everything about accountability. Jonathan remained focused on Ava. You keep returning to accountability, he said. Ava nodded. Because accountability is the only thing that was not preserved in any version of the record. The administrator shifted slightly. That is not entirely accurate, he said cautiously. There are oversight markers embedded within archival continuity logs. Jonathan turned to him immediately. Show me. The administrator activated a secondary layer of data. The screen changed again, this time revealing a narrow sequence of oversight entries tied to the original node. Jonathan scanned them quickly, then more slowly as he recognized a pattern that was not procedural but directional. Each oversight marker referenced approval of structure, not content. These are approvals of framework, Jonathan said quietly. Not of outcomes. The administrator nodded. Correct. Ava spoke softly. Because outcomes were never meant to be centralized. Jonathan stepped back slightly from the console. So the system was designed so that no single person could ever see the full consequence of a single decision. Ava met his gaze. Yes. Victoria's expression tightened again, but her voice remained controlled. That is a standard safeguard in distributed governance models. It reduces liability concentration. Ava responded immediately. It also removes the ability to recognize when a pattern is repeating across separated records. The words landed heavily in the room. Jonathan looked again at the central node, then at the branching structures. Extending from it. Then what I am looking at, he said slowly, is not just history. It is controlled fragmentation of causality. Ava nodded. That is what I saw the moment it happened. Jonathan turned fully toward her now. Then tell me what changed in that moment. Ava paused, her expression steady but more distant, as if recalling something that could not be fully translated into present tense. What changed, she said quietly, was that the record stopped belonging to anyone who could see all of it at once. The room did not respond immediately. Even the administrator remained still, his attention fixed on the screen, as though acknowledging that the structure he worked within had just been described in a way that no formal language had ever captured. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice lower than before. If no one can see the full record, he said, then no one can ever fully understand what they are responsible for. Ava nodded once. That is why the separation exists. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment, then back at the central node. For the first time, his expression was not analytical or defensive. It was something closer to recognition without comfort. Then the truth is not missing, he said slowly. It is distributed in a way that prevents it from ever becoming complete again. Ava's voice was quiet when she responded. That is what I meant when I said it became something that could never be seen the same way twice. The system map on the screen remained unchanged, but in the space between them, the meaning of it had already shifted beyond what any single record could contain. The silence inside the archival chamber did not disappear after the last realization. It simply transformed into something more structured, as if the system itself had shifted from explanation to conclusion. Jonathan Pierce stood in front of the central node display, his eyes fixed on the branching map that represented a truth too large to exist in a single frame. Ava Brooks remained close to the interface, her presence steady but no longer exploratory, as if she had already passed beyond discovery and into confirmation. Victoria Hale stood slightly behind them, no longer attempting to correct interpretation, but instead observing with a restrained stillness that suggested she understood the point at which systems stop being debated and start being accepted. The archival administrator remained at his station, hands resting near the console, but no longer actively guiding the access, as though even his role had shifted from operator to witness. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, carrying the weight of accumulated understanding rather than inquiry. If the record was divided at a single origin point, he said slowly, then there must be something beyond the node we have been examining. A point that defines why segmentation was necessary in the first place. Ava turned her head slightly toward him. There is, she said. The administrator hesitated, then entered a final elevated access command. The screen responded with a delay longer than before, as if the system itself was acknowledging the approach toward its most foundational layer. The display shifted again, this time reducing the complex branching structure into a single consolidated origin reference. It was not labeled with names, roles, or approvals. It was marked only with a directive identifier and a timestamp that predated every record they had previously seen. Jonathan leaned closer. This is earlier than everything, he said quietly. Ava nodded. This is where separation was authorized conceptually, before it became procedural. Victoria stepped forward slightly, her voice carefully measured. A conceptual authorization cannot exist without institutional framing. There must have been a governing body behind it. Ava responded without hesitation. There was a governing structure, but not a single decision-maker. Jonathan studied the display more carefully. Then what am I looking at? He asked. The administrator answered quietly, a consensus directive. The words hung in the air differently than anything before them. Jonathan repeated them slowly. Consensus directive. Ava nodded. It means the system was not divided by one decision. It was divided by agreement across multiple authorities who could not reconcile a unified outcome without creating contradiction. Jonathan stepped back slightly, his expression shifting for the first time into something closer to quiet realization. So the fragmentation was not an error, he said slowly. It was intentional containment. Ava answered softly. It was containment of conflicting truths. Victoria frowned slightly. Conflicting truths is a subjective interpretation. Legal systems are designed to resolve conflict, not preserve it in parallel states. Ava turned toward her. Then explain why parallel states still exist in every layer we accessed. Victoria did not respond immediately. Jonathan looked again at the origin node. If this was consensus, he said quietly, then every authority involved agreed to limit visibility of the full outcome. The administrator confirmed carefully. Yes, the directive was designed to prevent any single review pathway from encountering complete contradiction. Ava stepped slightly closer to Jonathan. That is what I meant when I said the record became something that could never be seen the same way twice, she said. Jonathan looked at her. Because no single perspective contains the full structure. Ava nodded. Exactly. A long silence followed, but it was no longer tense. It was reflective, as if the system had finished revealing what it could and was now waiting for interpretation to stabilize itself. Jonathan exhaled slowly, turning away from the screen for a moment and looking toward the far wall of the chamber. Then truth, he said quietly, was never removed. It was distributed by design so that it could never collapse into a single responsibility. Victoria spoke more softly now, her tone no longer resistant but contemplative. That would explain the lack of centralized accountability markers. Ava responded gently. It does more than explain it. It defines it. Jonathan returned his gaze to the display one final time. The origin node remained unchanged, but its meaning had shifted completely. If everything we have uncovered leads back to consensus, he said slowly, then there is no single person to confront, no single point to reverse. The administrator nodded. Correct. The system was designed to be non-reversible at the origin level. Ava looked at Jonathan. That is why I was there, she said quietly. Jonathan turned toward her. At the moment of separation. Ava nodded once. Not to witness a mistake, but to witness agreement. Jonathan studied her carefully. And you carried that forward until now. Ava replied softly. Until someone finally asked where the beginning really was. The room fell into a final silence, not of uncertainty, but of completion. Jonathan stood still, absorbing the full structure of what had been revealed, no longer searching for contradiction, but instead recognizing continuity in fragmentation itself. Victoria looked down slightly, as if accepting that some systems are not meant to be corrected, only understood. The administrator stepped back from the console, his role effectively complete. Ava remained facing Jonathan, her expression calm, as if the weight of what had been uncovered was not something she carried, but something she had always known would eventually be seen. Jonathan finally spoke one last time, his voice steady but subdued. Then the truth was never lost, he said. Ava nodded. It was distributed so that it could survive disagreement. Jonathan paused, then gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, not of resolution, but of acceptance. And in that moment, the system behind them remained active, but no longer mysterious, because what it had contained was not a hidden secret waiting to be found, but a structure of truth designed never to be fully contained at all.